Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Jan Kronberg, and I'm the National President of the Drug Advisory Council of Australia. We like to call the Drug Advisory Council of Australia DACA, so I'll be referring to it in that way throughout this session. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's a great pleasure and in fact a privilege to have two very special guests to introduce you to this evening. DACA is working very hard to provide important information in the area in terms of what we wish to achieve, and that is a very firm pushback on the acceptance of illicit drugs in this country, and to be persuasive of policymakers and those people who are capable of keeping the nation and the community safe. Tonight, we actually have some very special people in our audience, and I'd just like to make mention of the fact that we are reaching an audience in South Australia, in Queensland, in New South Wales, and throughout Victoria. So welcome to everybody across almost the length and breadth of this nation. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We have two of DACA's esteemed patrons with us tonight. We have Noel Ashby, APM, and we have Dr. Alex Callis with us tonight. In addition to that, we have two aspiring young people who would like to be elected to the Parliament of Victoria in November, and they are the Liberal candidates for Ashwood, Asher Judah, and the Liberal candidate for Box Hill, Nicole Werner. So welcome to both of you. It's terrific to have you with us tonight. Now, I'd like now to make mention of the fact that when you made a booking via Try Booking, you had the opportunity to make a donation, and we did receive some donations as people booked. I'd like to actively encourage you to make donations to us, as we are a voluntary body, and your donations do oil the wheels and allow us to work as we do. And we'd certainly like to improve that. And to that end, we are working to become a registered charity during the course of this year. And we look forward to your further support and your interest. And hopefully there'll be plenty of things that you'll be able to take away with you tonight by way of profound and important information. Tonight, under the headings of drug education in this country, the national curriculum, and worrying trends in both areas. And to start the discussion off tonight, I'd like to introduce you to a very successful young man who's currently a student at the University of New South Wales, Aiden Brennan. Now, Aiden, in 2020, was the school captain of an esteemed Catholic college, boys' college, in Sydney, in the North Shore. And he was very concerned about a number of aspects that were coming through that he saw through the lens as the school captain in that leadership role. And so, in fact, because of the position that he took, the vote for his position as school captain was a rerun, and he subsequently won by an even greater margin. He was very well supported by the fellow students in that school. And one of the things that he discovered when he was a student in Year 9, that the drug education program planned for the Year 9 students promoted harm minimisation policies. And the Drug Advisory Council has very great concern about harm minimisation policies, and really the information that's become available to us, we find it very hard to support that notion that's become commonplace amongst decision makers in this land for some time, for 3 decades now. And we find that a very troubling situation. Now, following an approach to school teachers, the senior teachers, the program was to go ahead, and it was delivered by a group called the Independent Drug Education of Australia. And this so disturbed Aidan that he had the opportunity to address parents on this issue. And in fact, once the parents were alerted to what was likely to be taught to the Year 9 students, a movement of the teachers saw that it was stopped. These are the sorts of things we want to raise your attention to, and perhaps, if you need to, cause you to act in a similar fashion when you see things that are concerning you within the education environment that you interface with. Now, Aidan had his story published in the Australian Spectator magazine, and we congratulate him for that. That's a mighty achievement for a young man. And that followed on with an interview on the Sky News Channel. So now, without further ado, I'm going to invite Aidan to address this group across Australia tonight. Aidan, welcome on board to the DACA webinar.
Well, thank you, Jan, and thank you to the whole DACA team. I've been in communication with a lot of you over the past couple of months. You've all been wonderful. I won't name everyone because it might take a while, but it's a tremendous thrill to be on tonight, and it's particularly tremendous thrill to be on a panel with Kevin Donnelly, one of Australia's foremost conservative thinkers and writers, and somebody whose work I've been an admirer of for a long time, and anybody should be and should read the books he's published and the interviews he's done on media. So, as Jan just very kindly introduced me, I was a school captain at a Catholic boys' school, and I know everyone always says, why don't you name the school? There are sort of legal reasons why we have to be careful. I think the school has since actually stopped existing under its previous name as well. That might be a bit of a clue for people on the Sydney's North Shore for which school this was. But that's why we won't name it, but I was the captain, the sole captain, the elected captain. And so I thought I might just start you off with talking about my experience running for these positions. As Jan said, I was published in The Spectator under the article, Generation Z is Fighting Back Against the Left Establishment. And I did a Sky interview, which you can find on YouTube. And that has the title, High School Captain and Classmates Fight Back Against Woke Orthodoxy. I talked about my experience in terms at those in those pieces of media, and if you want to Google them, you're most welcome to, but I'll also explain it to you now in as much detail as I can, and thankfully I have a bit more time so I can really go into detail more than I could on Sky. But essentially what happened was my conservative instincts were known at school. I was always opinionated. I was arguing with teachers from year 7, year 8. And by the time year 11 came around, we started having votes for captain. And I thought, I'll put my name forward. I wasn't, frankly, expecting to win. But I thought I had something to say. I thought I could put some issues into the discussion that needed to be put in. And so some of these issues, drug education was one, but I'm going to sort of put that aside just for a few minutes because I'll be going into a lot of detail on that. One of them was the anthem. They'd stopped playing the anthem at assemblies, which I find incredibly disturbing. We are in Australia, and Australia has a national anthem, and at any sort of ceremony, you really should do the anthem, especially if you're going to do the acknowledgement of country. And what was especially worrying, I'm not particularly against doing the acknowledgement of country anyway. I think sometimes it's probably done at a few too many events. That's just a personal view. But if you're going to do an acknowledgement of country, I think it's a pretty good rule that you also got to do an out. But particularly disturbing about this school was it was a Catholic school, and they were doing the acknowledgement of country before prayer. And I think that if you're at a Catholic school, it should be prayer before anything else. God must come first. So those were two things I sort of raised and put into the discussion. And I sort of politically ran it as a bit of a rebellious campaign, and sort of in a somewhat Trumpian style, sort of said, let's stick one up the teachers and vote for me, who, you know, I have very different views to the teachers, or at least some of the teachers. And we had a vote, and one of the teachers who was I had a good relationship with, told me, and he was a very senior teacher at the school, told me in confidence that I'd won 70% of the vote, which was a shock, a tremendous thrill and privilege. But then the head or deputy head mistress came out and said, we didn't have a clear result, so we're going to have to vote again. And they cut down the amount of candidates who were running this time. And they did allow me to run again. And they said, we're going to have another vote. So I'd won over 70% of the vote. I have that on good terms, but for some reason they had to have another vote. And they didn't tell us what the actual votes were when they said that there were many ties. So sort of, I think a lot of people were hoping or suspecting that there was a hope that perhaps my vote support might die down and other people would unite around a bunch of other candidates, because the first candidate field was very wide. But that didn't happen. In fact, in the second term, the second vote actually won over 80% of the vote this time. So got a swing to me. And I think at that point, the teachers sort of realized they were going to have to put up the white flag and deal with me as a captain and what I was going to do. And they sort of shelved me out of influence in the way other captains might have had, because I wouldn't just go along with what they said. No, that was okay. I had to find ways to sort of push my influence for that. So that was an example of sort of what we can be up against. They, like, I guess all positions and voting, they did pull some tricks out to try and stop me. And what I have to say about my school, one of the reasons I don't particularly love going around banging is they still did allow me to run. And I know a lot of schools don't allow any sort of democracy for their captains, and just it's a teacher's pet. You know, you're a good left-wing student, let's put you up and you'll say the right things. So my school was at least good enough to let me run and be captain. And that's why, you know, if anyone is listening who knows the school, it's a hell of a lot far ahead of some other schools. So that's certainly a good thing. So perhaps the defining moment of where I took on in this position the worrying trends in our national curriculum and in particular drug education was, as Jan mentioned, when I was in year 9, we had a person come in from an independent group and teach us about drugs, or, you know, it was a speech saying, you know, this is a speech about drug, what they call harm minimization. That's a very dangerous term in and of itself, because I think to any logical person, the best way to minimize your harm from doing drugs is to not do them in the first place. But that seems to be lost on a few of these people. So this person came in, this is year 9, so this is 14, 15-year-old boys, and we taught them some really worrying things. I'm just going to take it slowly and read out a couple of the quotes I specifically remember. These are probably the 3 worst quotes. There are some other concerning stuff in there, but I'll just sort of read it out to you. So first up is, ecstasy is 45 minutes of dancing and 15 minutes of sitting. I'll just leave you to ponder that again. Ecstasy is 45 minutes of dancing and 15 minutes of sitting. This is a drug that has killed people. Another one was, here's what to look for when picking magic mushrooms. And that was followed by a rather lengthy, and I've forgotten some of it, description on what to look for when picking magic mushrooms, as if it's ever going to be safe to be doing magic mushrooms and picking them, because, you know, you can pick the wrong one, and the drug itself is very dangerous as well. So that's a quote. Here's what to look for when picking magic mushrooms. They were teaching this to 14, 15-year-old boys. And finally, and this sort of, I always think this quote is perhaps the most telling because it sort of sums up the belief that underpins this harm minimization message. And that is that the worst thing that can happen to you with marijuana is getting caught with it. Now, as I said, that sort of underpins the message, which is the worst thing that might happen is the effects of getting caught rather than the effects of the drug itself. Now, marijuana has some terrible effects on firstly, everyone it has, you can get caught with it, and also it increases laziness, behavioral defects, all sorts of stuff. And in some cases, it can unlock schizophrenia inside a person, which I'd suggest is worse than, getting caught with it. But that's sort of this whole harm minimization push. It's around this theory that the drugs themselves aren't that bad. It's just the society that criminalizes them is that bad. And sometimes if the drugs go wrong, then it's bad. But the drugs themselves aren't that bad. That's the theory that underpins this whole message to kids. And it's wrong. As I said about ecstasy, people have died from ecstasy. And we see this as well in our contemporary politics with pill testing, is that what pill testing does is it tests if it is proper ecstasy or if it's laced with something else. And so if you get a green light and say that's just ecstasy and take it, that gives this false sense of security because ecstasy itself is dangerous. Anna Wood, the most famous case, and Leah Betts, they died from just pure ecstasy. So harm minimization does this whole song and dance around incorrectly minimizing the effects of the drugs themselves and suggesting there's all these other things that are going on that make the drugs dangerous. There's also a bit of a message of, well, if we have alcohol, which is what they call a drug, or something that is harmful to some people, why is that legal? Same with smoking. Why is that legal and why are drugs illegal? And I think it fails to understand the dangers are increasing with drugs, and with drugs as well, particularly sort of ice and some of that stuff. When you take it, you become sort of detached from logic and reasoning and your own sanity and become a danger to other people as well. So sort of idea that well, if we trust adults to have a few drinks, or they can still legally smoke, why can't they shoot up heroin? As this, essentially, that's what the logic is, and we see this in Victoria, in particular, safe injecting rooms and things like that. Well, these things are dangerous to others as well, and it's something that we need to go back to. Just say no. Now that the war on drugs is often one of the things you hear very often from the left and these drug education preachers is, well, the war on drugs hasn't worked. And I'd firstly suggest, well, harm minimization hasn't worked. Drug use is actually going up now, and people are still dying. And of course, that's logical because these drugs are dangerous and you have more people doing it, and you have this false sense of security given to young people. It makes logical sense that then people are going to do more drugs and suffer more harmful consequences of them. So that's the harm minimization message that was getting put out. And it was one I found really disturbing, and funny enough, a couple of years later, the school turned around and went, we've got a problem with people doing drugs. I wonder why, when you've introduced this sort of teaching to 14, 15-year-old boys. So I, as captain, went to the school executive, which was made up of teachers, and said, this has got to go. This is ridiculous to be teaching young kids this. It needs to be stopped. And I was sort of told, thank you for your opinion. We're continuing with it. And it looked like my efforts to sort of curtail this was going to be mitigated, or essentially not even mitigated, but just I wouldn't be able to change it. But I don't take defeat too easily. And I thought, well, there's got to be something I can do about this. So every month as captain, I would get to address the Parents' Council. And essentially what I was supposed to do is say, oh, the school's lovely this week, and go back and sit in my chair and everyone will clap. And the school will look wonderful. But what I did was I read some of the content, including those 3 quotes I read to you just a couple of minutes ago, that their children were being taught. Because a lot of parents, and fair enough too, the school don't exactly advertise these things, don't know what their kids are being taught. So I just told the parents that. That's all I did, was I just said, this is what your kids are learning and you have the right to know about that. And there was such a mutiny from the parents when they found out about this information. They were ringing up the school, they were confronting teachers saying, we're going to pull our kids if this doesn't stop, that it got pulled the next day. And that's how some change happened. And I think that really shows that the power parents still do have if they're armed with knowledge, because that was the danger their kids were faced with. And I think most Australians, and particularly Australian parents, are common sense, and they want to know what their kids are learning, and they will not accept this sort of extremism. We see it in other areas, and I'm not going to go into that today, with sort of the gender teaching, but on the drug teaching, they didn't know, they found out, they forced a change. And so that's why I always encourage people in any media I do, to any parents out there who have kids anywhere from the age of 4 to 18, talk to them every day about what they are learning, because these schools and these providers that come into schools, all it takes is one day and they can sneak some really dangerous thoughts into children's heads. I'm going to also, with what I mentioned there about these education providers, this is why they're so difficult to change. So I also spoke to my local state MP, and Felicity Wilson, and she said, look, I'm totally with you, this is not acceptable with teaching kids, but there's nothing really the governments can do about it because they're not schools. That's why the schools bring in these external providers. So the government can turn around to a school and say, you can't teach that, but what they can't seem to do, and there seems to be a bit of a legal loophole that I think people should be aware of, is that these independent providers come in and teach, sort of poison your kids' heads. And it's dangerous, and unfortunately, people often say, why aren't the government doing more to stop it? And that's a fair claim, but oftentimes the schools and the left institutions are finding ways to get around what regulation and what the governments are trying to do. And again, that's just something I think people should be aware of. As someone who's just come out of the system, I try and make sure people are as aware as possible, that be policymakers or just parents and students. This is how they get around some of these things. So again, it just comes back to basics. Ask your kids, what did you learn today? And they'll tell you. And if you don't like it, tell your friends, because it's really important to monitor what goes on, because kids' heads can be poisoned really quickly. I remember that meeting. I was so disturbed by it, of this drug meeting when we were in year 9. I reckon probably about 5 or 10 boys who would never have thought about doing drugs, who suddenly sort of got this impression that, oh, maybe it's not too bad, because an adult comes in, endorsed by the school, and tells you it. What are you supposed to think? So it's really a real worry, and it's something people need to be aware of. But there is some hope, as I've said. Firstly, in my own election, kids, I think they're starting to see through some of this propaganda, some of this indoctrination on a range of issues, including drugs. That's partly why I was elected. And there were other like-minded friends of mine who were elected in other schools across Sydney, who I've been in contact with, and perhaps one day we'll get them all on, Jan, and we'll all do a big panel discussion, because they all did great work as well. So it's not all lost. Some people, I have a theory that these things sort of balance themselves out in a countercultural way. So when these institutions start, as they have, begin swinging hard to the left and start teaching, drugs aren't that bad, the message almost becomes, well, if that's what everyone wants us to think, why do we think that? So 30 years ago, obviously the messaging was, don't do any of it. And there was a natural instinct in young people to rebel against that, unfortunately. But now they've swung it so far, I think young people are almost rebelling by not doing drugs, as sort of counterintuitive as that may seem. But it's a positive. And like I said, people they're voting. It'll be really interesting to see how younger people vote in this election. I think it might be less left than some people were indicating. Remember, it's Generation Z now. It's no longer millennials. Millennials are sort of 25 to 40-year-olds. So now we've got a couple, 18 to 25-year-olds, I think, are behaving quite different to that generation. That we are the sons of and daughters of Gen X rather than the baby boomers. And Gen X was a much more conservative generation than the baby boomers. So those are just, so when people say young people are so left-wing, I just think that's something for you guys, for everyone to think about. Is I'm not sure that's entirely true. They are being indoctrinated. There's no doubt about that. But I think some people are thinking, or a lot of young people are seeing through that indoctrination and thinking, well, if everyone's indoctrinating me with this, their natural rebellious instincts are to fight back against that. It's one other observation I have about that, which again, just for any parents listening, I find boys' schools and co-ed schools will have this sort of rebellious undercurrent to fight back against left-wing teaching, particularly when it comes really extreme on a range of issues. Girls' schools seem to not have it as much. Now, this is just my personal observation. There's no empirical evidence behind it. But I think there might be a bit of a problem when you have these female teachers teaching a group of female students when they're like 12, 13, that they're all victims. And once you convince someone that they're a victim of the patriarchy or whatever, it can become very difficult to talk any sense into some of these girls. So perhaps if you are planning on sending your daughter to an all-girls school, just don't necessarily not do it, but have a very thorough talk with them about it. Have a very thorough investigation into the school and its values. I'm sure there are some decently conservative schools around. In Sydney, I know Loreto Kirribilli. I find that to be a school where the girls I talk to are very sensible and intelligent. So it's not all girls schools, but just have a think about what you're going to do. And while boys schools, this doesn't seem to be a problem. So again, that's just something to think about. I like to give parents as much information as sort of possible based on my own experience and my own views. That's really all I sort of have to speak about. We have a wonderful webinar. I hope I haven't used up too much time, Jan.
Not at all.
Sort of throw back to you.
Not at all. Aidan, look, thank you very much for that address. I found what you had to say absolutely riveting. I was holding my breath through the whole thing. It just absolutely fantastic. And thank you very much for not pulling any punches, because it's really important for our audience to have a clear understanding as to what is going on. Now, there are questions that have been coming through via text messages that I'll put to both you and Kevin when Kevin finishes his address. But Aidan, we're very much in your debt for your address tonight. We'll now move to the introduction of Dr. Kevin Donnelly, who is a Senior Fellow of the Australian Catholic University's PM Glynn Institute and one of Australia's leading conservative authors and commentators. He writes regularly for the Daily Telegraph and the Australian, and as we all know, often appears on Sky News as a commentator. Kevin is a staunch defender of Judeo-Christianity and Western civilization. And his most recent book is Christianity Matters in These Troubled Times. And you can buy this book, and I have a copy of the cover. That's what the book looks like when you find it. And you can buy that at kevindonnelly.com.au. I encourage you to look to purchase a copy of his book that has just very recently been published. And I'm also very pleased to say that Kevin is a patron of the Drug Advisory Council. So I hope you pay close attention to what Kevin has to say as a specialist in education and regarded thus across this nation. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Jan, and congratulations on having this session, much needed session. Firstly, I'd like to also, well, I find it a bit difficult following Aidan because he is such an articulate young man who, and I'll call him a young man, I hope he's not offended. I'm being heteronormative, and that is an issue these days, as we know. But Aidan, you've done a brilliant job really conveying what is happening in schools. And the real problem is it's not just your school, it's schools around Australia. And that's been happening for 30, 40 years since the cultural left decided to take the long march through the institutions, whether it was family or church or political parties or the media, certainly schools and universities. So congratulations on standing up and fighting the good fight, because as John Howard says, the battle of ideas is something we should really engage in, whether we're young, whether we're at school or university or a career or an occupation. We should engage in that battle of ideas, because the cultural left, as I call it, are doing that every day. And we see that again and again. So congratulations, Daniel, on a great speech. Now, just very quickly, some of you will know I co-chaired the review of the national curriculum in 2014. And one of the areas we looked at was health and physical education. And there are a couple of issues there we found. One is the way the curriculum now is structured, and we're talking about preparatory or kindergarten to year 10 in all the different subjects. The way it's structured is very difficult for teachers to actually implement. It's very woke, it's very cultural left. The other issue is in health and phys ed, as you'd expect, it really pushes what most of us know, and it's been there for many years, as harm minimisation. So instead of actually pointing out to young people, whether in years 5 and 6 or 7 and 8 or 9 and 10, instead of pointing out the actual dangers of drugs, whether it's smoking, well, certainly, and I'll talk about that later, it's interesting that marijuana is now being pushed as acceptable and healthy, whereas smoking is now seen, as it should be, as something that is totally dangerous and should be cancelled, to use their word. But when you look at the national curriculum, and I'll just quote you a couple of passages here, if you look at years 5 and 6, under the heading Health, Safety and Wellbeing, students are told, and this is primary school obviously, students are told to script and rehearse how to refuse drugs that may be offered, such as medicine, tobacco or alcohol. In the curriculum, there's no discussion or detail about the actual physical dangers, mental and emotional dangers of drug taking. It more is about harm minimisation, which is script and rehearse basically why you might say no. And we know young people want to experiment. They want to be part of their peer group. So there's no real sort of red light flashing there in terms of telling young people not to do it. If you move on to years 7 and 8, under personal, social and community health, students are asked to investigate strategies and reasons why young people choose to use or not to use drugs, and promote strategies to make informed choices. So the question there is, you're giving young people, year 7 and 8, whether it's 12 or 14-year-old, a bit younger, you're telling young people that they have the agency to make decisions for themselves, and they should investigate and inquire the pros and cons of why they should or should not use drugs. And my argument would be, and I think Aidan has pointed this out, instead of doing this it could be good, it could be bad, you choose. We have to understand as parents and teachers that young people don't often have the ability, whether it's the intellectual or the emotional, to make informed, rational decisions about what can be drugs that can harm them, if not kill them, if not cause them great emotional and mental stress and anxiety. I go on to years 9 and 10, where the argument is, under personal and social community health again, analyse how social norms and stereotypes influence the way young people think about their bodies, gender, drugs, or risk-taking behaviour. So really it's just about raising their awareness of what might be happening more broadly in terms of these issues, without giving them a detailed and really clear sense that they might be not only medically dangerous, but also unethical, immoral, and dangerous to their well-being more generally. And it doesn't surprise me, as Aidan mentioned, that even in religious schools, this kind of harm minimisation is now the accepted way of teaching about drugs and the dangers involved. And as I mentioned, it's part of the cultural left's long march. And Aidan alluded to gender. We only have to look at what is happening now with the transgender movement, the fact that Catherine Deves in the election, forthcoming federal election, is being attacked for making the simple point that men, biological men, who self-identify as women or girls should not be involved in women's sports. The fact that she's being attacked and vilified, and even Liberal members of Parliament, and Zimmerman is one of them in North Sydney, but also others, Tim Wilson in Melbourne, even Liberal members of Parliament are attacking Catherine for her argument, a common sense one, that gender, sexuality, they're biologically determined. So it's been a great honour to listen to Aidan and to be involved in tonight's discussion, because as I often write for papers, as I've often argued on Sky News, we have to fight the battle of ideas. I mentioned John Howard, and we have to understand that young people, I'm older now, young people are our next generation or generations, and they have to be critically informed and knowledgeable, and teachers and education have the responsibility to make sure that that's done not to indoctrinate them or to coerce them, but to give them the ability to think critically. And so I'd be voting for Aidan for the New South Wales Education Minister at the next state election if I lived in Sydney. Thank you.
A way to finish your address, Kevin. Thank you very much. That was terrific, and I love the way that you tied it into what Aidan had to say. So thank you very much, and underpinning all of the concerns that so many of us with the Drug Advisory Council, with Touchstone, with our new national coalition, task force for drug prevention, all of the bodies we're associated with in terms of our concern and the need to push back on the madness of harm minimisation that is tied basically to the conquest of the society that we flourish in. So let me just put some of the questions that have come through whilst both of you have been addressing us as you have. So thank you very much. I have one for Aidan, and This one is from Victoria. Thank you for standing up against those in authority at your school, Aidan. You're a star. The question is, if teachers are supporting this crazy harm minimisation education, how can demand reduction educators who know all too well the devastating reality of drug use even get into many of these schools? That's a really profound point.
Well, it's a very, very good question. And it's an unfortunate reality that, yeah, teachers control who's allowed in and who's not. And people who want to come in and spread what we would all consider the sensible message of drugs are very, very bad, and they have risks that really a 14-year-old or 15-year-old can't properly evaluate. So don't do them. They are going to struggle to get into schools. There are, I'm sure, hopefully some schools out there that will let them in. There's still some that are run by sensible people. I'm always very careful. Teachers are not one block. There are some sensible teachers, and as I sort of alluded to a couple of times, that I had a few teachers who supported me on my captaincy runs and all that. So you just got to find sort of the diamonds in the rough. I'm sure there are some good people still out there. But I would also argue that getting into schools is perhaps not the best way to solve these problems. It'd be great if it could happen. But I think these education needs to be foremost done by parents. I think if parents, one, are educating their kids on the risks or not, that's where the child's success is going to be determined. All parents need to be taking an active role in everything their child believes. Really, schools just, in my view, should be the 3 R's, as people used to say: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Parents need to be teaching this sort of moral education, this sort of drug education. So I would almost, I don't know if this will be a view everyone agrees with, and that's okay, say forget going into schools. Parents, it's up to you, because a society that is thriving relies on its parents to be educating its kids, not its schools, because the schools will always be left-wing.
Oh, that is really a profound answer, Aidan. Thank you very much. And yes, we've got a long way to go to actually turn things around in terms of the makeup of the teaching cohort, unfortunately. And I hope that does occur, and I hope that those who have another view of the world and are not left-leaning get the strength to stand up and are encouraged to keep their professional commitment going. I have a question I'm going to put to Kevin, and I'm very pleased it comes, Kevin, from the Liberal candidate for the state seat of Box Hill, Nicole Werner. And Nicole is studying at Melbourne University for her master's in adolescent health and well-being, and she's had a lot of experience in community work as a social worker, and her question is really, I would say, quite a profound one. And she said, if she's lucky enough to win in November the seat of Box Hill, she'll really want to do something about this. What can we do to combat the woke erosion of education in our curriculum, particularly in Victoria? Kevin, over to you.
Well, I've spent a long time, I won't say how long, but since Joan Kerner, or Mother Russia, as I call her.
Mother Russia.
Since Joan Kerner was Education Minister and then Premier, on this very point. And there are times when I'm a bit pessimistic, but more recently I've been optimistic. Some of your viewers would know about, I think it's Ron DeSantis in Florida, the governor there, who's recently legislated against radical neo-Marxist gender theory being taught to young children. Now, he's not against arguing that everybody, every young person needs to be respected and valued, but he argues, and he's legislated, that the left, cultural left, should not indoctrinate young kids about gender theory, radical gender theory. And there are a number of other states in America, and I think it was, I'll just name him, Glenn Youngstown in Virginia recently won an election there. And Virginia was a Democrat or left state, but now it's Republican, because he argued against critical race theory, the argument from Black Lives Matter that Western cultures like Australia, England, America are inherently racist and guilty of white privilege. So in America, and also England, by the way, the United Kingdom's Secretary of State Education, he recently argued, and the government there again will legislate, to tell schools and teachers not to indoctrinate young kids with white privilege and cultural left ideology. So there's a movement in America and the UK, and generally they're a year or two before Australia. We seem to be at the bottom end there in terms of these changes, cultural changes, but there is a swing back in America, England, and other countries in Europe against cultural left ideology. And I just hope it does happen in Australia in the next year or two. And Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, recently argued, as did Alan Tudge, that the national curriculum should not be about what Geoffrey Blaney called a black armband view, but actually acknowledge, for all its faults and all its sins, that Western culture, Western civilization is beneficial and worthwhile and worth defending. So I'm just hopeful that things will improve. One approach, as I say, is legislating. I have argued in the past as well. The other approach is for governments to get out of the curriculum, to stand back from education, and as they do in America and England, have free schools or charter schools where school communities take control of what the school is doing. Because I agree with Aidan, and I've argued many times, parents are their children's primary educators. So it's parents who have the moral responsibility in particular to educate their children and to ensure what happens at school is in line with their beliefs and values. And that's especially critical for parents who are religious. Now, whether it's Jewish or Islamic or Christian, that's something that all parents need to consider.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I have a comment from Bendigo, Aidan, and it reads like this: Aidan for Parliament, exclamation mark. A young man I personally knew whose life was ruined by marijuana, and he was taken in his teens. He developed mental illness and died very young as a result. So there's testimony to what you were actually saying, Aidan. Now, I'm going to put a question to you, and it's a question for both speakers, and it goes like this. The need to fight back is essential. This is from Victoria. The need to fight back is essential. What strategies can be applied to fight and win, especially against an obvious lack of common sense? That's a hard one to deal with. How do you inject common sense into a population?
Well, you've got to start with, I have general faith in the intelligence and rationality of people and voters. And you've got to just mount the arguments. You can't vacate what some people call the cultural wars in favour of other things. you've got to mount the case. So in terms of, Kevin mentioned transgenderism in women's sport, I think it's apparent to everyone, especially in sort of contact sports, that people who have male bone structures and male testosterone and all these things should not be out there tackling women much smaller than them. I'm utterly unconvinced that that's an extreme view and even an unpopular view. But we've got to have the political leaders with the bravery to take on that argument. Whether we have that or not, I'll leave sort of for others to judge. I do think it is worth mentioning that the Federal Education Minister, Alan Tudge, did knock back an extremely woke curriculum last year. He said to the bureaucrats, no, I'm not signing this off, go back to the drawing board. So the government has done some work on it, and that's very good. But there needs to be more on these sorts of issues and fighting back. I do also think that there are going to be, as sort of Kevin mentioned, what I consider a natural counterbalance, and that the left, they're just going so far now that people who are sort of apathetic about politics will wake up and say, no, you're not teaching my kids this sort of stuff anymore. I'm not going to have it, and they'll take it out at the ballot box, possibly go to the streets, all these sorts of things. And we probably are a couple of years behind the UK and the US on that, because these things are just too extreme. And to bring it back to our main issue of drugs, and the commenter who rightly identified, and there'll be heaps of stories around the country like this, of someone's life being ruined by marijuana. So when people come in and say the worst thing that can happen with marijuana is you get a fine because you're caught with it, I mean, that is so obviously untrue and will contradict with so many people's life's experiences, that when they hear this sort of rubbish is being taught in schools, that they're not going to accept it. So getting what's out there and being taught in schools into the information of parents is a massive thing, and having the sort of political courage to take on these debates, and I believe win them, because Kevin mentioned Glenn Youngkin. He had this fight and he won in a blue state because of it. So I think it's politically beneficial to take on these fights, frankly, but you got to have the courage and the articulateness to do it. Hopefully we find some, well, I think Scott Morrison came out today and backed Catherine Deves, and I was pleased to see that. And hopefully political leaders don't abandon the cultural war fight, but go head first into it, because that's the only way we're going to bring common sense back to our society.
I thank you very much for that very well-rounded response, and I'm sure people will be very grateful for that. Look, I asked a double barrel a question for both of you, but I'm actually thinking as they're coming through, I've just adjusted that, Kevin, because I want to put one to you now. And it comes like this, and my heart goes out to this person. Not all academics and educators are of the left. This is a cry from the heart. But we are isolated and disorganised. We are willing to join your fight, yes, but don't know how. Any suggestions? Thank you. And I have this person's mobile number because they've texted me, so we could respond in time, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, it's an issue, and the research, England, America and Australia, shows that whether they're academics at university, but even teachers in Australia, up to 70-80% are left of centre, and that's the reality. I mean, when I was teaching, and I taught for 18 years, in the end I joined the IPA in Melbourne, the Institute of Public Affairs, and they do a lot of great work in the curriculum and teaching Western civilization, for example. In Sydney, there's the Centre for Independent Studies. There's Campion College in Sydney as well. There are also think tanks around Australia who are willing to fight the battle of ideas, as I mentioned. And so as a teacher, what I did was to join some of these and to find like-minded people and to enjoy entering into the debate and the dialogue. And it is difficult. I mean, in the end, I left the government system, and that's because I couldn't cope. In fact, I would never have been promoted under what Joan Kerner was doing all those years ago in terms of what she was mandating for schools. And I ended up in the independent schools where I found it was a lot better. Not all of them, but my one in particular was very good. So it is an issue. But again, I'm becoming more optimistic about this. I mentioned America with DeSantis and Youngstown. If you look at the last federal election, 2019, in Australia, and this is the broader issue now with the election coming up in 4 to 5 weeks. One reason Scott Morrison won and the Labor Party, when they reviewed the result, why they lost, is that conservative Christian voters, in particular in northern Queensland, and also Islamic and Christian voters in Western Sydney, but also parts of Melbourne, were wanting to get politicians who were standing up for good, conservative, common sense values. And that was the reason the ALP lost in 2019. And if Scott Morrison and the Liberal Party federally can really tell the linos, Liberals in name only, who are now trying to cancel Catherine Deves, if they can be silenced, and if the Liberal Party and the National Party can actually fight the battle of ideas, I think there's cause for optimism. But it is hard teaching. The other thing I do is buy a number of books that I have on my webpage, or else join groups like the IPA or the CIS.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And I could encourage the questioner there to actually become a supporter of the Drug Advisory Council of Australia as well, because you can see the sorts of subjects that we feel that we have to address, and that will put you in a good and strong network. So reach out to us again. There's another question, and this is from Asha Judah, and Asha is another Liberal candidate who's joined us tonight, and Asha is the endorsed Liberal candidate for the state seat of Ashwood here in Victoria. And Asha has said, in a state of great consternation, I would imagine, and exasperation, what will it take for Victoria to assert full control over its school curriculum? Has the federal state funding structure changed too much for genuine policy independence? Perhaps that's a question best answered by yourself, Kevin.
It's an intractable problem. I won't get too technical, but people talk about the vertical fiscal imbalance between the states and the federal government. And what that means is that the federal government takes the money, they take the taxes, and then they give it back to the states. But especially under Rudd Gillard, the Labor governments federally, but also under Liberal governments, the Commonwealth government then uses that to mandate what is happening in the curriculum and what is happening in schools. So there are normally triennial school agreements based on funding. Now that's an issue, and I've argued over many years that we should get rid of that. We should have greater autonomy and local control. And I'm at the Catholic University, and we talk about subsidiarity, and good conservative thinkers talk about, like Roger Scruton in England, God bless him, who died recently, and others talk about the need to get rid of centralised government, this top-down approach, and to have greater control and autonomy at the local level. So I would be getting rid of the federal system in education. I'd be really getting closer to the school communities and the parents and the teachers who have control. And that's why I talked about charter schools and free schools. And that's an international movement which is gaining traction. It's one that bureaucrats and politicians don't want, because bureaucrats and politicians want control. As they say, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, it's not as bad as that in Australia compared to Putin in Russia or Xi Jinping in China, but we do have an element of that where politicians want to take control. And the fact is we need to break that relationship. So I'd be arguing more strongly for greater autonomy and flexibility at the local level, as is happening overseas.
Kevin, thank you very much for that terrific response, and I hope Asha takes heart in what you had to say, but to have an appreciation for what a very big task it is. Look, I'm looking at the time, gentlemen, and our audience. We've said that we would finish at 8:30, and it's very much to time. So I won't put another question to you, but I think what we can actually probably surmise is that we could probably do another discussion like this a little bit later in the year, because I think this discussion has opened up many lines of that need to be questions that need to be satisfied, and it would certainly have got a lot of people thinking. I'd just like to make a comment about how severely dangerous marijuana is. We need to remember that it has been genetically engineered. So anybody feeling that it was okay to smoke marijuana in the 60s and 70s and that they're still okay, the offering now is infinitely more toxic and addictive, many fold, and infinitely more dangerous than what was available 50 years ago. And of course, it's been actively pushed, and the uptake frightens us. And this is why we're pressing the need to have heightened awareness as to what's being taught in schools, and for parents to not just push everything onto the teachers, as both of our speakers have actually stressed tonight. Teachers, families and parents and families in general need to be fully aware of what's going on in society, and there are plenty of dark forces who want to make money and want to inflict all sorts of suffering directly and indirectly on your children. We also know that young children are taking it up, and one of the means they're taking up, let's say, marijuana, is through vaping. So the big red alert message is no tolerance for any form of vaping, even if you think the substance is just something that might stop people smoking. That certainly is not the case. Lung cancer has been seen to set in after 2 years of vaping. And we now have plenty of empirical evidence that, in fact, smoking marijuana causes 27 cancers where tobacco causes 18. So the big bogey is cannabis, marijuana. That's been actively pushed right around the world by people who want to make a lot of money. The people who sanction this need to be questioned, and the whole notion of it being okay is just not on. Stand up and push back on these things. And in conclusion, what I would like to say is that many people say that the war on drugs failed, it was lost. We say the war on drugs was never fought, and it's pretty much time to actually adopt forward momentum and push back on the things that are so dangerous. My thanks on behalf of everybody listening and paying attention tonight. I hope that there have been some points that you might have made notes of. If you want to recall those points, you can watch this event again on YouTube, and I encourage people who know others who couldn't join us tonight to direct them to YouTube. The other webinars that DACA has conducted are also available on YouTube, and we have a number of webinars that are planned in May, early May, late May, and June in terms of more information on the importance of having your family fully aware of what drugs mean to you, your family, school communities, the wider community, this nation. You've heard from experienced people, experts. We hope you've got a fantastic take-home message. If you want to know more about the dangers of drugs, have a look at the Drug Advisory Council's website. That is daca.org.au. If you feel so disposed to actually help us with our work, please make a donation. You can do that by visiting the website. And on your behalf, I want to thank Aidan Brennan very much, and we'll have Aidan back, I think, because of all of the acclaim that he's received tonight, and I'll take up his offer of bringing other people in his orbit, in his cohort of friends and associates to bring their stories to you. And to our esteemed patron, Dr. Kevin Donnelly, thank you very much for your erudite contribution tonight, Kevin. And I just want to remind everybody to go to kevindonnelly.com.au, and when you see this beautiful blue cover shining out to you, you can buy one of those, a copy of that. That is Kevin's latest book, and he has many of his other published books available. If you want to know more about what is important reading in this subject matter, we have a recommended reading list on the Drug Advisory Council's website. Thank you very much, one and all. It's wonderful to have this audience around Australia. Apologies to those people, the many people who sent us questions. I'll keep those questions and we'll put them when we resume on this subject again. Just watch for our notices. We'll let you know when we're going to do this topic again. Aidan, thank you very much. Good night.
Thanks.
Good night to everybody.
Thank you.